So I'm joined today by Lyndon McIntyre. He's a best-selling novelist and nonfiction writer whose second novel, The Bishop's Man, was a #1 national bestseller and won the Scotiabank Giller Prize, amongst other honors. He's also a distinguished broadcast journalist, spending 24 years as the co-host of The Fifth Estate. His latest novel, published by Random House Canada, is The Winter Wives, and will be available for sale this summer. Lyndon, congratulations on your book. So I'd like to just first talk about the profession of journalism. How would you describe the current state of journalism?
Oh, it's pretty chaotic right now. I mean, you could go at that question from many different angles. The one I will go by is the trouble, the long-term peril in the present situation is the difficulty that smart young people are having getting a foothold in the business. I mean, we're going through a period of time in journalism where the delivery systems are being completely overhauled and replaced by new systems. And so you still have the community that wants to do journalism, tell stories that are important to the public life, and you still have the massive constituency of people that need that. What you have in between is a kind of a technological, systematic kind of breakdown and rebirth. And in all this confusion, a whole lot of people are falling through the cracks and falling off the profession. And that's bad for the profession. Because in my experience, there has never in the history of journalism been such a highly qualified, highly motivated, highly principled community of people who want to do that work and who are prepared right now to go out and do it for peanuts, who are prepared to sacrifice personal lives for the sake of this mission that they see. And the fact that these people are having so much trouble finding a home in this important profession is perilous, I think, to the future. And when I got into it many years ago, you basically had to be able to write your name on a piece of paper. And I know people who get in for absolutely most spurious reasons. I don't know what the difference is, but anyway, back in those days, those of us who got into journalism, some were highly qualified, some were highly intelligent, a lot were just sort of people who didn't have anything else in mind to do. So today you have a whole new professionalism, and that, ironically and tragically, it's a time when it is more difficult to get a job.
Do you find that media companies seem to have more of an agenda? I mean, shouldn't journalism be unbiased and a little more or less interesting outcome?
The companies have an agenda of survival. They were prepared to do anything to survive, and they will play to the lowest common denominator. I mean, politics isn't much different. The media will, the corporate management, proprietorial media will play to the lowest common denominator in the population and to the lowest form of subject matter. They will embrace hypocritically the most marginal, inflammatory issues and run with them to excite a readership or a viewership or whatever, and to survive financially. In spite of this, I think that generally speaking, in the trenches of journalism, there are a whole lot of people who are doing their best to resist this managerial proprietorial thing. I mean, as long as I have been aware of the profession and in it, there's always been a tension between the proprietor and the working person. And that tension back in the day used to lead to an awful lot of internal friction and disagreement and reporters standing up on their hind feet and sometimes with their fists because there were other jobs. You didn't like this proprietor, you quit and you went down the street to work for the other one. Nowadays, it's all different. It's a tight little market. If you got a job, you got sinecure, tenure, you're not going to risk it on a big argument over principle unless you're a very unusual and special person. Now, a lot of good writers, a lot of columnists and reporters, they're doing a very good job in spite of everything, but they're up against a hell of a difficult period of history.
Why do you think the consumer of media, the public, has such a difficult time now differentiating or distinguishing fact from fiction?
Well, because they have been brainwashed. A large part of the population has been brainwashed to, in order to control the way people react, the way people vote, the way people buy. And they've been brainwashed into thinking that there is no such a thing as objectivity, there's no such a thing as truth. Truth is whatever some interest group wants it to sound like or look like. And so people are confused by this. And people are also confused by the fact that there's just such a variety of sources. Everybody who has a computer can have a blog. Everybody who has an axe to grind can build a platform for him or herself. And so there's this massive confusion of material flying around. And it's reached a point where, everybody, even in the old days when you had your liberal paper, your Tory paper, your socialist paper, whatever, and people would shop for the place they felt more intellectually, politically comfortable. Well, nowadays the shop, it's a supermarket. It's full of choices, crazy fringe choices. And I think deep in the soul of everybody, there are crazy fringe thoughts. Most of us early in life realize to recognize them as crazy fringe and keep them to ourselves. But nowadays, there's a place to go with it, to pin it on the bulletin board. I have a crazy fringe thought. What do you think? And the first thing you know, there are 10,000 people lined up. Hey, I like your crazy fringe. I have the same crazy fringe. And suddenly you don't feel crazy or fringe anymore. And you're suddenly part of a movement. And suddenly a politician is saying, oh my God, we better take that movement seriously or we're going to be out of a job. And suddenly you have a nutpaper proprietor or a television manager saying, oh my God, we've got to take that crowd seriously or we're going to start losing money. And suddenly this nutcase with a piece of scrap of paper on the bulletin board, who wouldn't once upon a time have had the bulletin board to put it on, he suddenly is, or she, they're suddenly like international universal celebrities and taken seriously just because there's a lot of them out there. So, I think that makes it very confusing for people, and people got now pull back. Maybe Donald Trump is right. Maybe it's all fake, except when I say it. Maybe they're all liars. So, like, who am I to believe? So I will go and shop around and find somebody whose ideas and whose interpretation of the world is closest to the worst part of myself, and I will join.
You've been pretty critical of the CBC. First, when you left in 2014 amid mass job cuts, and more recently on their position around paid content. What's wrong with our public broadcaster?
Well, it's what I was just talking about. It's proprietorship versus delivery of service. The public broadcaster is a public servant. And this annoys a lot of journalists, but I say journalists are all public servants. So we are providing a service to the public. And if you don't like that label, then get another job. But right now, the public sector journalist, this institution, is struggling with an awful lot of the same problems that the private sector people are struggling with. And people don't pay a whole lot of attention to the fact that the private sector gets an awful lot of public support, either through legislation, regulation, and money, funding. The public, all we hear about is the public broadcasters cost $1 billion or whatever a year, and we're getting crap in exchange. Well, okay, so there's a lot of crap. But you know what? The delivery of crap by a production outfit is fixable by putting the right people in charge of the delivery, putting the right people in charge of the product. And the CBC has a great deal of difficulty finding the right people, to run the place and to exercise any kind of like really consistent judgment about what goes out to people. There's very little leadership now. Once upon a time, the CBC was a cultural leader in this country, and it isn't anymore. Once upon a time, it was brave enough to put stuff on television or on the radio that pushed boundaries back and attracted big new audiences. And there's a reluctance to take those chances anymore. There's a sensitivity toward political criticism now that goes back to what we were talking before. Politicians are terrified of fringe groups, and politicians will represent the fringe group in attacking the broadcaster. And the broadcaster hates to be attacked. Broadcaster, like any manager, likes to be liked because that's business. There's too much of a business ethos in the CBC right now, and that's people will say, "Oh, well, you're naive. How do you live in alien in distance from business norms and business ethos?" Well, you have to if you're a public servant. And the CBC is afraid of that label, public service. We are a public service broadcaster, like it or not, and if you don't like it, go someplace else. But leave the public service to public servants and allow the journalists to be public servants in the highest interpretation of what that means. And this kind of thinking, like there's the constant, endless search for the latest gimmick, the latest fad, the latest sort of amusement that's going to grab an audience. Whereas audiences, I think, want to be surprised. Audiences don't want to be condescended to. Audiences want to be surprised, they want to be excited, they want to be stimulated, and they want to learn stuff. It's all very simple. But there's just such a confusion out there in the general mass media that simple is probably too complicated for most minds.
We spoke about 10 years ago about your work on the Fifth Estate and how you would try to elevate a crime to a place where it has some deeper value. You said that it's possible to deliver the murder of the week and at the same time leave people thinking about humanity. Is that your, sorry? You said that, direct quote. Is that your objective when writing fiction?
Of course. See, the human experience is pretty kind of down and dirty most of the time, and that's where journalism finds its relevance and its authenticity in the minds of people we work for. And so you have to reflect murder, rape, pillage, war. All these things are part of this awful human experience. And the thing to remember as you're sort of reporting on it is that you're not reporting it to amuse people, you're reporting it to inform people. And you're reporting it, you have to report it in such a way that they'll come away not saying, "Wow, that was exciting." They come away saying, "That was awful." And if enough people consider it to be awful to do these things, or to understand why these things happen. One of my great frustrations with the media is the easy acceptance of the fact that people do bad things because they're bad. People do good things because they're great, they're wonderful. No, the reasons why anybody does anything, whether it's good or bad, are so complicated and so deep that when you're dealing with a murder and a murderer, I think it's incumbent upon you to find out, well, what? This guy wasn't born that way. In some cases, there are personality and biological disorders that cause you to do so. Well, let's identify that. But let's stop with this is an evil person. This is a bad person just because somebody did something bad. We're hearing a lot these days about this horrible murder in London, Ontario. And I keep saying to myself, it's really amazing how many people now feel that everybody else is a racist. I mean, I think everybody has the potential for racism in human nature. Everybody who is it's so complicated. It goes back to our primordial fear. Racism is an expression of fear, as is hatred, as is violence. These are all expressions of fundamental fear. Well, what are people so afraid of? And why are so many aspects of our society trying to feed into the fear and inflame it more? I mean, we take that guy who killed those victims and we just sort of we compartmentalize him morally as a wicked guy. And if we were Americans, we'd put him down. And there's a whole lot of us would would not be terribly sorry. Unfortunately, if you did that, you would lose any opportunity there is to find out, well, like, like, how come this fundamental hatred, violence, racism, whatever you call it, how come it got out of control in him? Most people subscribe to norms of behavior, or principles of justice, or principles of fairness, in our own best interests. I mean, as long as we're all on the same page about what's fair and just, we're going to be okay. But the norms got shaken badly in the last little while. And so now on that bulletin board, there's somebody saying, I hate people who subscribe to Islam. I hate women who wear burqas. And somebody said, wow, so do I. And the first thing you know, you got a whole wall full of that stuff. Once upon a time, I think, even if you thought it, you'd never put it up in public. And so you get a lot of weak-minded, sick people who are influenced by that. And this is the kind of conversation I'm interested in. I'm getting a little weary of people saying we're all racist or they are all racist, or like there's like we have to examine race. No, we have to examine behavior. I believe we have to examine behavior. Racism is like sin. You can examine it until the cows come home, and it's real easy to take a position. But what's more difficult is to examine why it happens. Why does it happen? Why does sin happen? Why does violence happen? Why does racism express itself as murder, terrorism? I mean, we could go on, but
you know, your book, The Winter Wives, maybe this is the right time to segue over, you know, is a bit of a study in human nature seen through the eyes of, you know, well, one main character in particular, but we get a good insight into the motivations of a number of characters. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the book and what readers can expect.
That's hard. The book started out as a reflection. There's a lot of, you know, a lot of problems around us, and we have people suffering dementia. It's increasingly a part of every family now, and it's a problem that has complex and deep causes. How you live with it is a whole other issue, and it occurred to me that the living with it, there's two faces on the living. One is the person who has it, and then there's this larger community of people who are affected by the person who has it. People who care about that person, who live with that person, care for that person. So there's a certain liberation in for a while anyway, in the realization that you have a condition that is not your fault, but it explains a whole lot of things in other people's minds, explains why you do stuff, how you would behave, and the rest of it. And what if a person gets a diagnosis of dementia, and comes to terms with the fact, well, you know, I don't have to really watch myself so much anymore. I mean, people will say, oh, that's the dementia. And so he gets engaged in stuff, and he just sort of like changes and in his behavior, because there's a less of a restraint on him. And people would say, well, there's a less, if you have dementia, there's less restraint. Well, if the diagnosis sort of enables you to just assume you have left, well, then you do stuff. And he does a couple of things. He gets engaged in some things that he would probably have considered wrong, except, well, I'm not thinking straight. And he excuses himself. And then he finds out that the diagnosis was wrong. What does he do then? Does he gather everybody and say, hey, everybody, I don't, you know, this Alzheimer's diagnosis, this dementia, early onset dementia that I thought I had and that I mentioned to you, and I don't really have it. Then, oh, well, so then when you did this, that was really you? That wasn't the dementia that did that? You got a lot of stuff now you got to explain in terms that are a bit more nuanced and for which you have to take ownership now. So what do? Do you just, oh, I'm going to keep it to myself. I'm going to let them think as I said I was. And now we can all celebrate the fact that I'm living a whole lot longer than people normally do, and that I'm actually more in control of my life. And isn't that great? So he's faced with this little bit of a dilemma. Now, I'm not going to say too much more about it because the story is not that complicated. It's a story about a fellow who grows up with a physical disability. And as a consequence of the physical disability, his whole educational and his process and his socialization is altered. He's homeschooled mostly. He's in the hospital a lot, and so he's like learning, a correspondence course and all the rest of it. He doesn't really get to relate with many people outside his parents. He's got no siblings. And then at a certain point, he has to go to school, and he's a teenager now. And now he's suddenly dropped into a social situation, and he's not ready for it. Mm-hmm. So he evolves in this way, in good ways and in bad ways.
Whether it's the snowmobile accident or Sundays with Peggy, our protagonist, Byron, his recollection of events are always kind of fuzzy, but his moments with Alan seem incredibly vivid and detailed and well recollected. Why do you think he's more invested and present in a friendship with another man than his relationship with the women in his lives?
I don't know. I think that in many cases, men have an easier time sustaining friendship with men. And in his particular case, he was a bit confused because when he got dropped into a social situation, he established a very strong friendship with Peggy. And Peggy happened to be the belle of the Peggy was the popular girl. She was the it girl in high school. And suddenly Peggy was interested in him, and he was interested in Peggy. But because of the way he grew up, he had no kind of sense of how you move that relationship beyond the kind of the infantile stage where you're just buddies and friends and whatever. And then he becomes very close friends with Alan, who was the physically and in many ways the opposite of him. Alan is the campus football star. He's the middle linebacker. He's huge. Byron is a little guy with a limp. And for some strange reason, Alan sees something that he likes in Byron, and Byron likes that, but he also sees something fascinating in Alan. And they form this friendship which extends through their lives. And but at the same time, those kinds of friendships are often remote and long distance. And so you don't always know everything about what the friend's like. And that's the way their friendship grew. It was just a kind of an organic friendship that survived long periods of time, great spaces of distance. And the one thing that sort of kept a link is that the friend knows what he feels about Peggy, and he knows what that means socially, biologically, emotionally, and everything else. He ends up with Peggy. Byron is confused. Like, how did that happen? And so Byron's life evolves in this realm. Peggy and Alan's life evolves in this realm, and then later in life they all come back together again.
Age, regret, recognition of the passage of time. These are prominent themes in the book. I often hear that people write what they know. Are these things that you find yourselves concerned with at this stage of the game?
Well, I've always been concerned with them. The whole concept of friendship. I grew up a little bit like Byron did, actually. I mean, not because, physically handicapped, but I grew up in a little place where there were very few kids of my age for a lot of reasons. Hardly any, actually. And And so when I was a teenager, I made a couple of great friends. I actually made a friend a lot like Alan, big, strapping athlete who went on to a kind of an interesting lifestyle. But anyway, aging is something that I think we all reflect on once we get past uh, our 20s, let's say. From 30, I once upon a time used to be a traumatic event to turn 30. And then 40, oh my God, and then 50. And then all of a sudden somebody come up with a great idea, 50 is the new 40 or something like that. And then it was 60 is the new 50. I mean, it all changes, but the reflection on age and relationship never really moves much from the time you become conscious of these things as important. And so, so the book becomes, it doesn't, I don't intend the book to be a vehicle for reflection on growing old or reflection on being handicapped or somehow facing the limits of your mortality. But these things come up kind of automatically. If you're going to look at people's lives, and if you're going to look at people's relationships, you will eventually have to wade through all this stuff, about getting old. When you first make a friendship in your teens, you don't anticipate that the time will come in your 50s, when the friendship will either not exist anymore, or if it does exist, it'll involve a totally different kind of a relationship. And the same in marriage, you're like absolutely fascinated by a female or a male, whatever. You become totally sort of besotted and all the rest of it. And then, of course, if the relationship continues, you begin to notice changes. And as time goes by, as various aspects of your existence move out and other ones move in. And in your 50s, you may find that the entire basis and structure of that relationship with the guy or the woman has totally changed. And yet the relationship is just as important, just as valuable, and something that you maybe you even value it more. So these are little things that I can't like push them off the table when I'm thinking about telling a story. I mean, you started off by asking me about this murder thing. Well, I have done some fabulous murders, and I've met some great murderers, but I have never, when I was dealing with the murder or the murderer, been able to like push aside, well, who is he? Where did he come from? One of the most bizarre was this, they called her the Black Widow. She was a woman who used to, she was an elderly woman, but she was very well preserved, as they say. She looked good, she could fix herself up, and she could become attractive to old guys who, several of them just died. Perfectly healthy old guy just died, and suddenly everybody caught on. She was getting control of their medication or whatever. And I ended up sitting in a small room with this woman in a prison in Florida once. And, it's awfully tempting to turn it into a kind of an entertainment tonight piece. I got the Black Widow. But I just could not resist trying to find out who she was. I mean, she, this is a woman, and you learn that she had a really awful life as a kid, as a young woman, as a woman sort of looking for a way to survive and latching onto situations and opportunities and always going the wrong direction. And who is to sit back and say that that's just because of her, because she's a bad person, or to say, well, you know what? This could be a fate for all of us. There was a fellow, I spent the last year of his life very close to him. He was on death row in Texas, and he had brutally, if you just looked at the crime, he had brutally murdered a senior citizen woman, widow, living by herself. When you get into it, he was one of three people, and he was not the instigator. He was a guy who said, oh, sure, I'll go along with that. She keeps She got a wall safe with all that money in it, and she lives alone. Let's go. Before the night is over, this woman is dead, and he's the guy that's held chiefly responsible. So I got to know him. I don't know why I got to know him. He was a Canadian. I went down to cover his execution. His execution was postponed. He let me in to talk to him. I talked to him a couple of times before the first execution date. And then I went in to see him after it was postponed, or he got to stay. And I came home and I figured, he's got to stay. He's definitely going to get a commutation. So we started writing to each other. It turned out he loved poetry. Not just Ryan. He loved like Dylan Thomas and people like that. And so I would photocopy stuff and send it to him. And then the execution was rescheduled. And I ended up going back down to spend the last few days around him. And I came away saying, what a shame. The society is just going to put that guy down without ever examining the reasons why he ended up the way he ended up. He was a perfectly normal guy up to a certain point in his life, and something happened. And I know what happened, but I'm not going to get all speculative, but I know what happened to him. And I talked to family members who said he went from this guy to that guy overnight. And he was only a boy. And it's just downhill from then on. And here he is on death row in Texas. And I spent the last few hours before they took him away to the execution chamber, just shooting the breeze. And he was just philosophical. He didn't feel sorry for himself. And I came away saying, as far as the United States justice system is concerned, this is a guy, he deserves to die because he's evil. And I say, well, he did an evil thing. I'm more interested in why he did the evil thing than I am in getting him dead, because I think that's an evil thing. Mm-hmm. But it's a very unpopular view. But I want to know what, and I want the world. I know from having spent a year communicating with this guy, what probably accounted for a large part of what he did. But I wanted to know more about that, and I wanted more people to know about that. So I go back to the point where there's hardly a thing that is relevant to the human existence experience that I can really get into in isolation from like the why, the big why. Why do we do stuff? Mother Teresa was supposed to be like the exemplary human being of her age. And yet people who examined her life and her behavior intimately and deeply found that, she had warts like the rest of us. In her case, she did more good things than she did bad things. So she was defined as a good person. No, she wasn't a good. She was a person who did good things and who probably also did some bad things. My murderer friend was a guy who did a bad thing, but he also did good things. He had empathy. He felt, like he felt deeply about people who were worse off than he was in his mind. So if you have the privilege in our culture of being able to tell a story about that's rooted in reality, I think you have an obligation to go deep into it and to find out the why of things. Who is this person really that you're dealing with? And take them apart as much as you can.
So I guess we'll just conclude with, I would say, you've had quite a bit of a body of work over the last 10 years. I'm assuming that, things don't just end with the wrap up of the Winter Wives. So what do you sort of have planned next? Is there anything?
I'm going back to my roots. I'm going back to nonfiction. And I'm working on a book about a character I encountered in the course of various other projects as an individual that had played a big role in Irish history, and then ended his days in Canada as a almost anonymous figure. But his role in Irish history was, at a particularly sensitive time, was pretty major. I don't know how he survived, but he did. He lived long. He had good, important friends, and he had a couple of little things in his history that worked to his great advantage. And so that it's a hard book to do. I spent the last year and plus trying to research it without being able to go anywhere, without being able to get into a library or an archive. I mean, like, you know, you can see I also have a growth on my head. But you know, it's a fascinating project, and because of the delays of the pandemic, it'll probably take a couple of years more to put on the table. But I hope I can pull it off now that things are loosening up a little bit.
Well, that'll be great, and we'll look forward to that. So I just want to say, with one, good luck with the book, and two, like the launch with the Winter Wives and your next project. But two, I really enjoyed this. So thanks for taking the time to speak with us today, and hopefully we'll get to do this again sometime.
I hope so. Thank you.
Have a great day.
You too. Bye.